road is there when you arrive, then it isn't. 4 kilometers of stone pavement running straight across the Bay of Bourgneuf on France's Atlantic coast, connecting the island of Noirmoutier to the mainland as clearly as any road you've ever seen. You can drive it, cycle it, walk it. On a clear morning, with the light coming off the water on both sides, it is one of the strangest and most beautiful roads in France. Then the tide comes in. The Atlantic covers it completely, to a depth of up to 4 meters at full tide in the time it takes to eat a slow lunch. If you are still on it when this happens, you have 2 options. You can drive very fast and hope your timing is better than it looks. Or you can climb one of the 9 iron towers spaced along the road's length, specifically built for people who miscalculate and wait for the water to drop again. Your car stays where it is. The sea takes it for a few hours and gives it back later, salt-packed and seaweed-draped, if it gives it back at all. Every year, some number of people make this mistake. Every year, the towers are used. The Passage du Gois has been doing this to people since before anyone thought to call it a road. There is something in the towers that tells you everything you need to know about the French relationship with the Passage du Gois. A government that genuinely wanted to prevent people from being stranded would close the road more aggressively, or build a second bridge, or do any number of things that did not involve installing climbing structures at regular intervals in the middle of the ocean and calling it a safety measure. The towers are not a solution. They are an accommodation. They are the official acknowledgement that people will continue to misjudge this road, that cars will continue to be swallowed by the bay, and that the correct response is to ensure stranded travelers have somewhere dry to stand while they wait. This accommodation is older than you might think, and understanding why a road was built here, not despite the tide, but into it, knowingly, with full awareness of what the sea would do twice every day, requires going back to a question that has never fully been answered. There is a structural decision buried in how this road was built, one that goes against every principle of road engineering, that has kept it standing through 85 years of twice-daily submersion by the Atlantic. Most roads built into moving water are eventually destroyed by it. The Passage du Gois has been getting stronger. We get to it. But first, why here? Why this? The island of Noirmoutier sits 4 kilometers off the Vendée coast in the Bay of Bourgneuf, in a part of western France where the tidal range is enormous and the landscape changes character completely between low and high water. At low tide, the bay retreats to reveal sand flats stretching in every direction, glittering and traversable and rich with shellfish. At high tide, the same flats vanish under several meters of Atlantic. The island, when the tide is up, is properly an island, separated from the mainland by a stretch of open water. When the tide is at its lowest, it isn't. Noirmoutier has been inhabited for at least 1,000 years, possibly considerably longer. Its economy was built on 3 things the sea provided: fish, shellfish, and salt. The island's salt marshes, still visible today, still producing fleur de sel harvested by hand with wooden rakes, were among the most productive in western France for centuries, supplying the inland regions with a commodity that was, before refrigeration, one of the most economically important materials in Europe. The salt was essential. Getting the salt to market required getting off the island. Before the Passage du Gois was formalized, this meant boats. Boats to Fromentine on the mainland. Boats for every delivery of salt, every purchase of grain, every sick person who needed a doctor on the other side, every journey that had to happen regardless of wind and weather. Boats are reliable in their unreliability. They cross when the wind allows and the sea permits, and they fail to cross when neither cooperates, and there is nothing to be done about it except wait. The Gois was never a better option than boats in any absolute sense. It was narrower and time-constrained, and it didn't work at all for 4 months of winter when the tidal exposure was insufficient. But it was faster when it worked, cheaper, and accessible without maritime skill. A farmer with salt to sell could load a cart and drive it across without owning a boat or paying a ferryman. That specific economic logic, direct access, no intermediary, no weather window beyond the tide itself, is why people used the ridge before anyone had paved it. At the point where 2 opposing tidal currents meet in the bay, the ocean has been depositing silt for millions of years, not evenly, in a thin ridge, following the line of an ancient submerged platform, rising just high enough above the surrounding seabed to emerge when the water retreats. That ridge runs from the island to the mainland for 4 kilometers. When the tide drops far enough, you can walk across it. When the tide rises, it disappears. The people who lived on Noirmoutier knew about this ridge before any map recorded it. They crossed it on foot, carrying goods, moving animals, navigating by memory and by the feel of the sand beneath them. The word they used for the crossing, gois, from the local patois meaning to walk with wet feet, was purely descriptive, not a road, not a path. A wet thing you walked across when the water let you. The first written mention of the crossing dates to the 9th century. The first time it appeared on a map was 1701. The first recorded formal crossing was 1766. For most of those centuries, the gois was simply a fact of island life. The window the sea opened twice a day, irregular in its timing, dangerous in its edges, irreplaceable in its function. Then the engineers arrived. The question of when the Passage du Gois became a road rather than a ridge is harder to answer than it sounds, because it was transformed gradually, over 2 centuries, by people who were solving specific problems without necessarily intending to build something permanent. The first wooden markers were installed around 1780. Stakes driven into the seabed at intervals to guide crossings after dark or in poor visibility, or at the edges of the window when the tide was already beginning to move. They told you where the ridge was when you couldn't see it. They didn't change what the ridge was. It was still a natural feature, still underwater most of the time, still governed entirely by what the Atlantic decided to do. By the 1840s, a regular horse-drawn carriage service had been running across it, carts loaded with salt and fish and whatever the island needed from the mainland, guided by the wooden markers, timed by the tide. Then, in 1868, the surface was stabilized for the first time. Stone laid over the shifting sand, the ridge hardened into something that maintained its shape between crossings. By the late 19th century, it was classified as a departmental road. By 1932, it was National Road 148, which meant it had a number, an official existence in the French road system, responsibilities for maintenance, and the implicit promise that it would be there when you needed it. This is where the story becomes strange, because a road that is underwater for 21 out of every 24 hours is not, in any ordinary sense, a road that will be there when you need it. The tide doesn't care about road classifications. National Road 148 disappears twice a day, whether France acknowledges it or not. By the 1930s, the surface was deteriorating. The sand beneath the stone was shifting. The stone itself was breaking apart under the constant hydraulic pressure of the tidal cycle. An engineer named Louis Briand was commissioned to do something that hadn't been done before on this scale: pave the Passage du Gois properly. Make it a surface that vehicles could rely on, not just when the tide allowed, but every time the tide allowed, for as many decades as the maintenance budget could extend. He spent 4 years doing it. Not 4 years of continuous construction. The Gois construction site was unlike any other in France because the site was only accessible for roughly 2 hours per day. Low tide exposed the ridge long enough to work, then the water returned, and every tool, every material, every worker had to be clear of the surface before it went under. 4 years, 2 hours a day, from both ends simultaneously. Think about what that means for the pace of work. A normal road project operates continuously. The same crew on the same stretch, advancing systematically, building out from what they finished yesterday. On the Gois, yesterday's work was underwater this morning. The workers arrived, the surface appeared from under the retreating tide, still wet, still covered in the seaweed and sand the last high water had deposited. They cleared it. They worked. 2 hours later, the tide was rising again from the edges, and the foreman called time, and everything went off the road before the sea came back. Brian's foundation system reflected this reality. He couldn't build in depth the way a land engineer would, sinking foundations, compacting layers over time, building up the substrate incrementally over weeks. Everything had to be laid and left to the ocean's judgment. The wooden piles were driven into the seabed in a single low-tide window or across several, providing an anchor that could survive the hydraulic pressures of the tide moving over and through them. Concrete was poured, stone was laid, then a layer of sand, not as a temporary measure waiting to be replaced, but as a deliberate engineering decision. The sand mattress beneath the final stones was meant to flex. That last detail is the one most engineers find counterintuitive. Everything about road building on land is designed to resist movement. You compact the substrate, you lock the surface, you fight any settling or shifting that would crack the pavement. Brian did the opposite. The sand absorbs the micro-movement of each tidal cycle, the constant hydraulic pressure of millions of tons of Atlantic water flowing over and through the structure twice a day. A rigid road would crack within years under that load. A road built to accommodate the movement rather than deny it could last decades. The stones Brian specified weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms each. Each one measured 40 centimeters by 40 centimeters by 12 centimeters, large enough and heavy enough that the tide couldn't shift them, but not so massive that they couldn't be handled, and laid by workers with the limited time and equipment the 2-hour window permitted. Each stone went down by hand. The workers carried them from carts positioned at the road's edge, laid them in sequence, and moved on. 2 hours later, those same stones were under 4 meters of water. The project employed workers from 2 local firms, Philbert Dupont from Noirmoutier and Jean Cornu from Bouin, working from opposite ends toward the middle, exactly as Brian had planned. The men from Noirmoutier started from the island side and worked toward the mainland. The men from Bouin started from the continental side and worked toward the island. They met somewhere in the middle of the bay, on a road that was simultaneously their workplace and a temporary loan from the Atlantic. Brian also supervised the construction of the refugee towers in 1930 before the paving project began. He designed 3 larger towers and 6 smaller ones, spaced every 500 meters, built in timber with iron rungs and guardrails, high enough to stand above the highest tide, sturdy enough to hold the weight of several people waiting for the water to drop. He was building safety infrastructure for a road that didn't yet have its final surface, acknowledging in steel and timber what the authorities would never say plainly: people would get caught. This was not a solvable problem. It was a manageable one. Nobody can say when the last stone of the 1935-39 project was placed. The records don't preserve that level of detail. But sometime in 1939, the last worker on the Passage du Gois climbed off the surface before the tide came back, and the road he had spent 4 years building went underwater for the first time as a finished road and came back when the water dropped. It has been doing that twice a day since. There is a military episode in the Passage du Gois' history that no travel article bothers to mention because it requires knowing something about the Vendée War. the most brutal internal conflict of the French Revolution, which tore apart this region of western France between 1793 and 1796. On the night of October 12, 1793, a royalist general named François de Charette assembled 3,000 men on the mainland shore opposite Noirmoutier. The island was held by a small Republican garrison. Charette wanted it, a potential supply point, a refuge, a strategic position his army needed. He had tried to take it once before, a few weeks earlier, and his men had turned back. He had no intention of letting them turn back again. At 1 in the morning, Charette led his men onto the Passage du Gois. The tide was low enough to cross. The island was visible ahead of them in the dark. What Charette knew, and what he had calculated carefully, was that within minutes of setting foot on the causeway, the tide would begin to rise behind them. By the time the rear of the column was committed to the crossing, retreat would be impossible. The Atlantic would close the road, and there would be no going back. The accounts say that when his men realized this, when they felt the water rising around their boots and understood that the way behind them was no longer there, a general communicated what Charette had intended them to understand. There was no other way now than victory or death. 3,000 men with no retreat charged the island garrison in the dark. The garrison, 800 strong, surrendered. Noirmoutier fell in hours. The tide did what no orders could guarantee. It removed the option of retreat from an army that had previously used retreat too readily and replaced it with a simple arithmetic. Forward was the only direction the water had left available. Charette had not simply crossed the Passage du Gois. He had used it as a weapon against his own men, understanding that a road the ocean controlled was a different kind of strategic asset from any road a general commanded. 3 months later, the Republicans retook the island by crossing the same causeway. The same tide that had carried Charette's attack carried their counterattack. The Gois does not take sides. It simply opens and closes on its own schedule, and whoever times the crossing correctly gets to cross. It decided the fate of a royalist conquest in October 1793. 2 centuries later, almost to the month, it decided the fate of a bicycle race. Which brings us to July 1999, 2 centuries later, and a road that was still wet from high tide an hour before 189 professional cyclists were asked to race across it. The second stage of the 1999 Tour de France began on Noirmoutier Island and returned to the mainland via the Passage du Gois. The organizers knew the road's reputation. They knew the surface, original 1930s stone, polished by decades of Atlantic, coated in a thin film of sand and seaweed that the tide had left, would be treacherous. What they may not have fully calculated was what would happen when 189 riders tried to navigate a road 4 meters wide at race speed with a hard crosswind blowing off the bay. Lance Armstrong, positioned near the front, described the crossing afterward in his memoir. The road was so slippery that riders hesitated to turn the wheel at all, while a crosswind made it difficult to keep the bike straight. Those at the front of the peloton picked their way across carefully and emerged on the mainland. Behind them, someone touched their brakes. What followed took seconds. 25 riders went down in a crash, triggered by the whetstone, the seaweed, the residual tide. Among them, Alex Zula, one of the pre-race favorites, and it was his birthday. Ivan Gotti, Michael Boogerd. The riders who crashed and survived scrambled to get back on their bikes, but the group at the front had seen the opportunity and accelerated hard into the mainland roads. 6 minutes. The crash on the Passage du Gois split the Tour de France peloton by 6 minutes on a stage that was supposed to end in a sprint finish. Armstrong won the 1999 Tour. Zula finished second, 7 minutes 37 seconds behind, the margin shaped in large part by those 6 minutes lost on a road that had been underwater 90 minutes before the race arrived. There is a specific irony here that took years to fully materialize. Armstrong was later stripped of all 7 tour titles by the USADA for doping. The 1999 race was vacated. No rider was declared the winner. So the race, whose outcome was decided by a tidal road that shouldn't exist, was itself erased from the record books, making the Passage du Gois's role in deciding it both pivotal and permanently suspended in historical ambiguity. The Gois was there before the race. It will be there after the record books settle their arguments. The bridge opened on July 7, 1971. 583 meters of pre-stressed concrete connecting the southern tip of Noirmoutier to the mainland, permanent and reliable and completely independent of the Atlantic's schedule. It costs nothing to cross. It takes 3 minutes. It is open at all hours, in all weather, regardless of the tide. Since 1971, the Passage du Gois has been optional. For the first time in the island's history, the residents of Noirmoutier had a road that didn't answer to the ocean. They could leave whenever they wanted. Goods could arrive at any hour. Emergency vehicles could cross without checking a tidal chart. Sick people could be transported to mainland hospitals without a family member standing at the bay's edge, watching the tide table and calculating whether there was time. The problem the Passage du Gois had been the solution to, for centuries, was solved. The Passage du Gois remained in service. This requires some unpacking because on the surface it makes no sense. The bridge is safer, faster, always available, and only 3 kilometers away. Every practical argument points toward the bridge for any journey that isn't specifically recreational. Delivery trucks use the bridge. Ambulances use the bridge. The school bus uses the bridge. Anyone with something that matters to get across uses the bridge. But the Gois handles, by official count, hundreds of thousands of crossings per year. In 2021, nearly 388,000 crossings were recorded. That is not a heritage attraction drawing occasional visitors. That is a road in daily, regular use by people choosing to cross at the correct hour rather than drive 3 kilometers to the bridge. The choice is made constantly, deliberately, by people who understand the constraints and accept them. Part of this is the shellfish. The low tide that exposes the road also exposes the sand flats on either side of it. The same flats rich with cockles, clams, and oysters that islanders have been harvesting since before the road existed. A crossing of the Gois at low tide is not just a transit. It is access to one of the most productive shellfish grounds in the bay, temporarily available to anyone with a bucket and the patience to work fast before the water returns. The road and the harvest are the same window. Part of it is the salt marshes on the island's western side, still worked by hand, still producing the same fleur de sel that made Noirmoutier commercially significant for centuries. The producers who sell it bring it out over the Gois not because the bridge doesn't exist, but because the Gois is part of the product's story. You don't bring Noirmoutier salt to the mainland over a concrete bridge. You bring it over the road that knows the tide. A producer interviewed by a French regional newspaper some years ago described the routine of his family's crossings in a way that has stayed in the local memory. You check the chart the night before, you load the cart at dawn, you cross when the numbers tell you to cross. His grandfather had done the same with a horse. The numbers were the same numbers. The tide cares nothing for the century. The only difference was that his grandfather knew the chart from memory, and he checked it on his phone. And part of it, the part that is hardest to quantify but most important to understand, is that the Passage du Gois is not just a road. It is the road, the one the island had before the bridge, before the ferry service that preceded the bridge, before any of the modern accommodations that have made Noirmoutier accessible without paying attention to the Atlantic. The Gois is the crossing that required something of you. That taught you to read the tide before you drove into it. That punished inattention with a submerged car and a climb up a rescue tower and a long wait in the cold, the Passage du Gois, the race of the Gois, sends athletes running across the causeway every year as the tide rises. The top competitors don't start at the first exposure of the road. They wait. They let the water begin to recede and start when their shoes are already wet, timing their crossing against the ocean's schedule rather than their own, running 4 kilometers on a road that is simultaneously a race course and a slow-motion trap. Whoever finishes last crosses the line with the water at their ankles. This is a race designed around the premise that the road is more interesting when it's dangerous, that the constraint is the point, that the best version of this crossing is the one where you feel the tide coming. Every year, some drivers still miscalculate. Every year, the iron towers do their job. The question the Passage du Gois raises, which no other road raises in quite the same way, is what a road owes the people who use it. Every other road in this series was built because someone needed it, and the need was urgent enough to justify the cost. The Transfiguration was built because a dictator was afraid of Soviet tanks. The Guoliang Tunnel was cut because people were dying on a cliff path and the government wouldn't help. The Darien Gap wasn't built because the people who could fund it found reasons not to every time the moment came. The Passage du Gois was built because a ridge in a tidal bay had been functioning as a road for centuries, and the French state decided in the 1930s that if people were going to use it anyway, it should at least have a proper surface. Louis Brienne was not sent to overcome the tide. He was sent to make the accommodation more reliable. That is, when you say it plainly, a different kind of engineering ambition from anything else in this series. Not defiance of nature, not imposing human will on hostile terrain. Something closer to negotiation. Here is what we will provide. Here is what the ocean will provide. Here is where those two things will be in agreement twice a day. The sand mattress that absorbs the tide's pressure rather than resisting it is not just a structural technique. It is a philosophy. A road that resists the forces on it eventually fails. The force wins, the pavement cracks, the substrate shifts. A road designed to accommodate the forces becomes, in a specific technical sense, more durable. The tide that would destroy a conventional road has been moving through the Gois's foundation for 85 years, and the stones are still there. There is no other road in France, perhaps in the world, where the builders made the explicit structural choice to let the sea through rather than keep it out. Every causeway, every bridge, every harbor wall in the engineering tradition was built on the premise that the water is the problem and the structure is the solution. Brian built a road on the premise that the water is a given and the structure is an adaptation to it. The sea has been right about this place for much longer than engineers have been building roads through it. The tidal ridge that became the Passage du Gois has been forming and submerging for 2.5 million years. The Atlantic will still be moving through the Bay of Bourgneuf long after the last stone Brienne's workers laid has worn to gravel. The road is not winning anything here. It is simply in a long-term arrangement with a geological force that is patient beyond any human timescale, and the arrangement has held so far. So far. Drive the Passage du Gois at the right time, an hour before low tide in the evening, when the light is flat and the bay is glossy on both sides, and the 4 kilometers of pavement runs straight toward Noirmoutier like an argument against the ocean, and you will understand something that no other road in France can show you. The road smells of the sea even when it's exposed. Not the salt air smell of a coastal road, but the specific smell of something that has been underwater recently. Brine and organic matter, the complex particular scent of a bay floor briefly elevated to the surface. The stone under your tires is still damp at the joints. The seaweed the last tide deposited is drying in patches across the pavement, still dark and slick where the shadow of a cloud has kept it wet. Somewhere in the distance, on the flats off the road's edge, people are bent over picking cockles. The tide markers at the road's edge tell you in numbers what you can see visually: how high the water gets, how recently it was here, how soon it will return. The waterline on the nearest marker is well above the level of your car's roof. You are driving along the bottom of the sea. The 9 towers pass one by one. Each one is a question. Do you know how much time you have? Do you know what the tide chart says for today? Are you the kind of person who checked? Most of the cars that have been swallowed by the Passage du Gois were driven by people who thought they knew, who had been here before, or who had been told it was fine, or who looked at the road clear ahead of them and decided the warning signs were for other people. A driver who climbed one of the towers after misjudging the tide told a local journalist that the strangest part was not the water rising around the car. It was watching other cars make it across while standing on an iron platform 6 meters above the bay. The road was right there. He could see it. It was just under 4 meters of Atlantic, and it would be there again in 5 hours, and there was nothing to do but wait. He said it felt less like an emergency and more like a very specific kind of embarrassment, the kind that comes from being the person who didn't check something everyone else checks. The Atlantic does not distinguish between tourists and locals, between confident drivers and cautious ones. It knows the schedule it has kept for 100 million years, and the road that humans built into it in 1939, and the time, twice a day, when it reclaims what it briefly agreed to share. There are crosses at both ends of the Gois, not decorative, memorial crosses for people who didn't come back from their crossing. The road that has been in use since before records were kept, that Charette crossed in the dark with 3,000 soldiers and the tide rising around their boots, that Brian's workers laid stone by stone in 2-hour windows, that 25 Tour de France cyclists crashed on in 1999, that 388,000 people crossed in a single year. That road has also, over its centuries of use, taken people who timed it wrong. The crosses don't say how many. They just mark that it happened. Brian's sand mattress absorbs the pressure. The stones stay where he put them. The towers wait. The tide comes in. And in the morning, when the water drops again and the road surfaces once more from under the Atlantic, someone will arrive at the eastern end of the Passage du Gois and check their watch against the tide chart and judge that there is time, and they will drive the 4 kilometers across the bay floor, past the towers and the crosses and the shellfish pickers working the flats, and emerge on the far side on the island that has been connected to the mainland by this road for 1,000 years of recorded memory, and almost certainly longer.